Let's do this thing. So my name's Richard Campbell. I've been, I make a lot of podcasts. Any .NET Rock listeners in the room? Oh yeah, okay, great. So you guys know what's coming. Oddly enough, I've been involved with the history of .NET to some degree or another. So .NET Rocks was started back in 2002 by my friend Carl, before the word podcast existed. That's why we call it an internet audio talk show. So we weren't clever enough to come up with the word podcast. And once a week, we interview some luminary. A bunch of the speakers here at the show have been on before. Run As Radio I started because I was annoyed because there wasn't any good IT podcast that didn't just crucify Microsoft all the time when we're all still using it. So that's where that show came from. That's been once a week since April 11th, 2007. And then the tablet show existed for a brief period of time that's actually very relevant to today's topic. So we did it for about 3 years, and I'll talk about why when we get to 2011 in the history conversation. All right, let's get started. Let's do the history bit. So I'll do a tour through the Microsoft logos, starting with the 1970s disco logo of Microsoft, which, by the way, they brought back at Build. They actually had it up on the wall, right? It's the 50th anniversary of Microsoft. They're all excited about it. And Microsoft was a programming tools company, right? The very first product was on the Altair, which Hanselman had a mini of today, but the full-size Altair, basically the precursor to the S100 bus machine. This is the thing that got Gates to drop out of Harvard to write a version of BASIC for it in a whole 4K of RAM, which, near as we can tell, there are no copies left of. The only one that I've been able to find anywhere is actually in the Computer History Museum in California, but that's the level 2 RAM, the 8K version of it, and that's actually Gates's handwriting on it. This is before floppy disks or even cassette tapes. You're literally reading punch tape, paper tape to load the program into a machine like the Altair. So Microsoft's very first product is a developer's product. It's BASIC. Now, if you fast forward into the 80s, now we're in the hairband logo era, right? And Microsoft changes gears because they get an opportunity to build an operating system, right? Which really they buy the operating system from another company, license it to IBM to become IBM's DOS for their first microcomputer, the 5050. And they keep the rights to make their own incarnations of it. It becomes MS-DOS. And so now they're writing operating systems and to provide their development tools across the board. And that is one of their big winners, right? They get big on that, and things grow quickly from there. When we go up into the 90s, so now it's sort of the Friends logo. And Microsoft now has enough different dev tools. They're trying to figure them all out. They consolidate them into a common package they call Visual Studio. The very first version is called Studio 97 because it's 1997. And that's when they have Visual Basic 5 and Fox Pro 5, which they'd acquired. J++ 1.1, yes, a version of Java made by Microsoft. And InterDev, which is one of their first attempts at building a development tool for the internet, which is not going well. C++5, they made many versions of that, and a bunch of other good tools. Now, the funny part about this is there's nothing unified about the original version of Visual Studio. Each of the products had their own IDEs. The only shared IDE was between J++ and InterDev, and that was because of Anders Hallsberg. He was doing the implementations and trying to build a unified development suite for everything. Now, the second version of Visual Studio comes out the following year, and it's called Visual Studio 6 because numbers are hard. And this has all the version 6s in it. So it's VB6 and C++6 and Fox 6 and InterDev 6, but it's actually the third version of InterDev because there was a 1 and a 1.1, but the 2 is now called 6. And the fourth version of J++, because there was a 1 and a 1.1 and a 2, then the next one was 6, because numbers are hard. And also, very importantly, source safe, which will come back to haunt us later, and the visuals and the NT option pack, which is where Internet Information Server lived. Now, these aren't happy times at Microsoft. This is still the 90s, right? We're in 98. In fact, I've got this picture of Bill and Steve, and look how happy they look. right? It's a good time, right? This is July of '98. And a couple of years before that, Bill had been on the cover of Time as the master of the universe because his plan all along had been to put a PC on every desk. And he kind of pulled it off by the end of the '90s, right? He was everywhere. And then the U.S. Senate in '98 asked Bill to come talk to them. And if you want an example of how not to talk to politicians, go on YouTube and watch this video. I guarantee you Mark Zuckerberg has watched every minute of this because this was bad. The way he treated the Senate was and they've even admitted later, like they were doing everything they could to make sure that Microsoft was not behaving badly because they just wanted to walk away from this. But arguably, this deposition over several days led to the Department of Justice prosecuting Microsoft as a pernicious monopoly. And that's the time cover you get. So from master of the universe to busting Bill in 4 years flat. And these guys don't look quite as happy anymore. So this is from January of 2000. In November of '99, Microsoft is declared a pernicious monopoly by the Department of Justice and ordered to break up into a company that makes operating systems and a company that makes everything else. And this is the announcement of Bill stepping down as CEO and Steve Ballmer becoming CEO. Bill will go on to be chief architect. And Ballmer's first mission is to stop the company from being broken up, which he will succeed at, right? But we don't know that at this particular moment. Now, this is a pretty tumultuous time. This is 2000, right? So a lot of stuff's being figured out. And Steve starts talking about stuff like next generation Windows services. And he also is when he says Linux is a cancer, he's making friends. By November of 2001, he will succeed in getting the consent decree. So it'll take him almost 2 years to stop the company from being broken up. And they're going to make the source code of Windows available to certain companies that need it for whatever reason. And they're going to be a more open company all around. And I tell you all of this to set the stage for the world that .NET gets born into. Because this is while .NET is gestating. Now, if you're going to talk, one of the things to understand about .NET is that it was never really an intentional product. It's an emergent product. It emerges from a bunch of different efforts going on in different parts of the company. It's why it's always been a bit weird, because there were different people doing different things. So let me put faces to the three major components that make up .NET. But understand that behind each of those faces, as familiar as it may be, is a lot of people working very hard. So we'll start with Brian Harry. Now, remember I mentioned Visual Source Safe. So Brian, out of North Carolina, was making a source control system that got acquired by Microsoft and turned into Visual Source Safe. And while he was there, he was moved off of that product and into the Windows team. And one of the missions that he was given in the Windows team was to come up with a common runtime. So here, the problem that Windows had is Microsoft had all these different development tools. And each of them had to manifest the features of Windows themselves. And so as a new version of Windows would come along, each of the dev teams sort of had to assess for the visual features and aspects that are the next version of Windows, how is our programming language going to surface this? And this frustrated the Windows team. They wanted more consistency. They wanted it to happen faster. And so there was an energy to create a common runtime. Right? It's got nothing to do with new programming language. It's got nothing to do with any of that stuff. Just a common runtime that all of the dev tools could lean on. Separately, there was Anders Hallsberg. Now, Anders is a legend, right? This guy was Turbo Pascal, and he was at Borland when he made Delphi, and he got recruited by Bill to join Microsoft to work on Java tooling. That was why InterDev and J++ shared a common dev environment. That was Anders driving that. But by 1998, the Sun got a cease and desist against Microsoft for making Java anymore, because Microsoft was very rapidly becoming the most popular Java vendor on the planet, and they were optimizing their flavor of Java to run really, really well on Windows. But that also broke the covenants of the way Java was supposed to be written. And so Sun pulls it back. So suddenly Anders doesn't have a job. And Microsoft doesn't have a development tool for enterprise. And so Anders proposes a programming language. He has this idea that it would be a C-like language, but object-oriented, or C-object-oriented language, or cool. And if you remember, if you were around in those days, the first time we saw this language, all of the type structures started with cool. That's why. Third is our friend Scott Guthrie. So Gu had joined the company directly out of university in 1997, graduated from Duke, North Carolina, summa cum laude, and he had interviewed around the year before, and he was thinking he would go to Windows. And Jay Allard convinced him not to. He said, listen, don't go where we've solved the problem. Windows is already dominant in the industry. Go where problems need to be solved. So he joined the NT Option Pack team, and that was to fix IIS and active server pages. This was Microsoft's one of their more successful forays into web development, but it was kind of behind the times. It needed to be improved, and so that's what he worked on. Now, the timing for when he joined the company, he joined in the fall of '97 as they were coming into delivering Studio 6. And so by the time, and they delivered that right at the end of November, and then normally after they finish a big ship like that, it takes a year and a half, they take a couple weeks off, and that's fully into December, so they took all of December off because then it's Christmas. But our friend Scott he'd just gotten there, and he didn't really want to go back to North Carolina, so he stuck around the office right through Christmas, took a day off and went skiing up in Utah, but that was about it. But he worked on an idea for an alternative to active server pages. At the time, he called it ASP++, and it had a request and response model, but a better programming environment. And the scripting language he was using was Java, because that's what he had, right? This is the end of 1998. So he shows it off in January of '99. They're like, cool, except we can't use Java anymore. So find an alternative, which sort of sends them into the woods for a year or two. He made a version that was dependent on XML that's never seen the light of day, and we're all happy for that. But the first time the public, all of us actually, hear anything about .NET is in July of 2000. And this is at the PDC in Orlando. And by the way, this is the only version of this graphic that's 1080p, because in 2000, this original graphic was 320 by 200, and I paid a designer to reproduce it at full scale. I've had Microsoft people ask me this graphic, like, no, it's mine. I made this, and there's a few others you're going to see. So they're nice and clear in 2025 because they're 1080p graphics. So what was fun about this PDC, this is Bill's first foray as CEO doing the keynote. And he talks about this new platform. You can see the .NET logo in the corner there that nobody saw coming. We were expecting VB7, and instead we got this thing. And he called it a new platform based on internet standards. Now remember, it's July of 2000. He's still negotiating the consent decree. He's not going to get it till November of 2001. So he talks about everything being open. In fact, it's so open, he's going to publish a specification for C# and the runtime as ECMA specifications, just to show how open Microsoft is now. Right? It's all part of his negotiating tactic. And they really do this, but the ECMA specifications are not really all that complete. So there's not any real sense that anything would come of it, but something will. This is also 2000, so we get Windows 2000, which is the point where they take the 9X line and the NT line and merge them. So we have the NT runtime, and we have a sort of rugged interface on this. It's not very pretty, but it works. This is also the first generation of the P4, the first time a processor breaks 1 gigahertz. It's also the first time that Windows defaults to TCP/IP as the networking, because maybe this internet thing's going to be something. Who knows, right? The default before that was NetBEUI. And it's also when NT abandons the HAL, the hardware abstraction layer. So it used to be you could run it on Alpha and MIPS and PowerPC and Intel, but it's 2000, it's Intel or nothing. Around this same time, in 2001, a very young Miguel de Icaza, this is actually the picture from the speaker list in the O'Reilly conference where he was speaking. He's 29 years old. It's July of 2001. He's been looking over these ECMA specifications that they just come out a few months before, and he wants to make a version of C# that runs in Linux, which is a great way to ruin your life. Because Miguel had been working on GNU for ages, right? He was all about a UI. He was a Linux guy, but now he's working on a Microsoft technology, and Microsoft is the enemy. So all the Linux guys are like, why are you working on Microsoft technology? And all the Microsoft guys are like, aren't you that Linux guy? So he sort of traps himself in this crazy middle ground. Now, he'll name this product after monkey, so it's called Mono. And it'll take him a couple of years to do they're very worried about Microsoft suing them, so they do a white box or a clean room implementation of .NET. They have no access to the code base in .NET at all. All they have is, these are the function calls, reproduce them, and see if you can get them to match up. They'll get their first release out in 2004. It does take a little while. At the Professional Developers Conference, Los Angeles in 2001 is the first time we get bits for .NET. This is the pre-release bits. Now, this is also a tough time, right? This is, we get the release candidate, we get the first version of Studio.NET. This is also around the time that Windows XP ships. Not the beloved version of Windows XP, the first version of Windows XP, right? We called it Windows 2000 with the Fisher-Price interface, right? Because it was all round and curvy and cute, right? But there's no USB support in it or anything. It was a pretty basic version. This is also when Microsoft gets hammered with viruses. This is when Anna Kournikova comes out and Code Red, all these things that'll lead to Bill putting out the Trustworthy Computing Initiative in 2002, which will actually delay .NET for quite a while because they try and go through and improve the security inside of it. Also, because of that declaration, they decided they're going to have to make a more secure version of Windows. And so they split up the team in the Windows team. This will be very consequential going forward. So SP0 is just shipped. There's a whole SP1 is already defined because it's all the stuff that didn't make it into SP0. They now need to take many of the most senior Windows team members and have them focused on making another service pack to fix the security problems, right? That will eventually become SP2. And there's still a .next group, or vNext group that are working on the next version of Windows as well. So the Windows team is split up in all these different chunks because they're trying to finish SP1, they're accelerating SP2 to deal with security issues, plus Next. And so in February 2002, we get the first vision of Visual Studio .NET. They'll eventually drop the .NET. So this is the version 1 of C# and sort of all the fundamental pieces in it. They will eventually build they'll take Fox Pro out of the box entirely. It's still got C++ in it and a bunch of other tools. Because of the deal with Sun, they build a version of Java called J# that allows you to compile your Java code against the .NET runtime so that you can move off of Java without actually breaking the path forward. And they make an open source version called Rotor, but it's not open source the way you think about open source today. It's purely source available for academics only. You can't compile it, you can't modify it, you can just look at the code. And when they marketed it in the presentation in February 2002, they were the opposite of Java, right? Java was one language, any platform. When they shipped .NET, they said, 22 languages, one platform. Name 22 languages. Took me a while to round them all up. So the first few here, C#, C++, VB, J#, JScript, that's all Microsoft. They built those. There's a bunch of industry ones. APL, COBOL still maintained by Fujitsu. I think it's up to Studio 15. Fortran's maintained by IBM. A bunch on the right here are mostly they got university teams to build them. So they only existed for one version. But these were all the languages that shipped in .NET V1. Pick your language, do whatever you want. As long as it's C#, you'll be fine. All right, now we get 1.1, which is the second version of Studio. This is 2003, and it's got all the fixes in it, so we're starting to clean things up. It's still not that robust, but they're getting there. And they're driving towards a new version of Windows as well. So in PDC of 03, this is another one of those upscaled graphics, is when they talk about the next version of Windows. So the code name for XP was Whistler, right, which is a mountain not far from where I'm from in British Columbia. The code name for the next Windows was called Blackcomb initially. And I think part of the problem here is that Bill was now chief architect, so he really had too much time on his hands, so they were trying to make an all object-oriented operating system. And you got to think, in 2001, 2002, like they are kind of dominant in the operating system space. Like now that you're at the top, so why don't you just go for it? Do something crazy, right? Try to go all out. So trying to build this wild operating system with all these powers, and they realize they've just gone too far. They can't do it, so they dial it back. And if you ever go up to Whistler Village in British Columbia, where there's the Whistler Mountain and the Blackcomb Mountain, between the two mountains there's a really big bar called the Longhorn Bar. And so what we learned about at PDC03 was Longhorn, right, which had the 4 pillars. It had Avalon and Indigo and Arrow and WinFS, right? Avalon was the new rendering system for onto the screen. Indigo was the new messaging solution. Arrow was the semi-transparency UX devices, and WinFS was this object-oriented file system. And the next year they shipped Windows XP SP2. And this is where this is a really difficult decision to make. Why? They shipped it as a service pack, even though it was a breaking change to Windows. This is when we get introduced to stuff like user access controls, right? The UAC dialog that drove everybody crazy, because they really are trying to secure things more. So it is a breaking change to Windows. Normally it should have been called Windows XP version 2. But they wanted to give it away. This is back when they only sold Windows. So by making a service pack, everybody would install it, even though it was a breaking change. But it had another consequence, which is that in every volume license agreement inside of Microsoft, there's a little statement there. Volume license agreement is how big companies buy Microsoft products. They pay per seat, a flat rate, and they get everything. And in that contract, it says, you'll get a new operating system every 5 years. And they shipped XP in November of 2001. Remember that date. Now they've just done Service Pack in 2004, to Service Pack 2, and so they haven't reset the clock on that. We get our third version of Studio, which is .NET 2, because numbers are hard, but arguably the real fruition of what .NET was meant to be. The 2005 edition was a much more robust version of .NET, and the reason it got so much better was SQL Server. What? So the SQL Server team had been bugging the .NET team for a while for a more robust programming language inside of SQL Server. There were big companies that were using SQL Server to analyze huge amounts of data. And normal querying, you have to haul that data out of the database to do querying with it. They wanted to do querying within the database because it was faster. I mean, today you would do this with streaming technology. But in 2003, this wasn't even a term yet. So they were just trying to have a stronger language. And the .NET team thought it was a really bad idea and were kind of resisting it. But it's Microsoft. You can't just say no. So in 2004, Brian Harry's moved on and Jason Zander's now taken over the runtime team. He sends a few guys over to the SQL team to sort of evaluate what would it take to run .NET inside of SQL Server. Now, we'll assess how good an idea, but let's get a scope of the difficulty of it. And while they're there, they learn about SQL Server's debugger. So SQL Server was a world-class, ultra-reliable piece of software. It had been since 2000. And one of the reasons is that they built this incredible debugger that only broke on a unique execution path. So you could run hours-long, days-long workloads on this thing, and only when it ran through a path that it hadn't run through before would it actually stop. So if you're looking at a 1 in 100 million executions bug, this is your tool. Right? It's brilliant at solving that problem. And the .NET team had no equivalent, not even close. But if they were running .NET inside a SQL Server, they would get that capability. So those guys went back to Xander and said, listen, you got to see this debugger. Like, we got to do this. And the process of spending a year integrating .NET into SQL Server hunted down 34 incredibly rare bugs inside of the framework. And it's the reason that .NET 2 was so much more robust than the earlier versions. This was a version of .NET you could fire on a server and expect to run for months, unless you wrote any code against it and you wrote leaky code, because then it's your fault. The framework itself was incredibly robust. That's what made this version so good. So everybody's pretty happy. This is a great version. This is when 64-bit support comes along, so now you can compile as any, which is a really bad choice. Don't do that. Compile as any works really well as long as you only compile to 32. As soon as you compile to 64, you'll crash because you don't have the right drivers. Well, I already know. And ASP.web Forms is a charm. People love it. They're working well with it. But it's not a real scalable technology. If you take it too far, you run into problems. And there's competitors out there now. And so guys like Guthrie are getting really worried about how the open web is evolving, that they're missing the boat on this. And so they decide to make a new conference, a conference called Mix. Again, I have the only good graphic of Mix from '06. But this was an idea of how does Microsoft get better at doing web development, inviting open web people to be involved, and they start to build other tools. And this is when we get IE7, right? IE6 had shipped with XP in October of 2001. Now we finally get IE7. And you kind of wonder, like, where were those guys? Why did it take 5 years to come out with the next IE? They were working on Avalon, on what would become XAML. So that, think about how that works. It was very much the same concepts around that. So this is also when Vista comes along. Oh, Vista. When XP2 ships in 2004, the Windows team is so far behind getting the next version of Windows out. Remember, they only have 5 years, right? November of 2001, they have to ship by November of 2006 to be compliant with the volume license agreement. Jim Allchin had been leading the XP2 effort. Brian Valentine had been leading the Longhorn effort. Valentine chooses to retire rather than get fired for the situation that Windows is in. Allchin completes SP2, looks at the situation in Longhorn and goes, okay, everybody out of the boat. He actually pushes Balmer for more time. Let's renegotiate the contract. Balmer refuses. Not going to be a thing. He has to ship something by November of 2006. So he boots out all those pillars. WinFS, Avalon, Indigo, they all get shoved out and pushed over onto .NET, right? And the .NET team has to make an emergency version of .NET that they call 3, even though the runtime's still 2 and the language still 2, but it also inherits Avalon and Indigo and so forth. There's a rule. If you have a really cool code name, you get a really bad product name, right? So Avalon becomes Windows Presentation Foundation, and Indigo becomes Windows Communications Foundation. And so while otherwise it's still .NET 2, it's now called .NET 3, but all those things are now stuffed into it. So that's the interim fix. And the only version of Windows Vista that will ship in November of 2006 is the Enterprise Edition, because that's the one that's in the volume license agreement. They're also counting on a fundamental truth, which is that sysadmins will not install the SP0 of anything. And you really didn't want to install this version of Windows. It was not finished, right? It had serious problems in it, including one bug where it would load everything into memory twice. They'd have it all fixed by May of 2007, right? And that's fine, because that would also be Service Pack 1, and that's when the enterprise people actually use it. So the expectation is nobody's going to use this. But there was one group of people who did. Reviewers. The Paul Thurrots and Mary Jo Foleys of the world. And they took it over and they went, ooh. To the point where by the time it was fixed, even my mother saying, I don't want any of that Vista. I'm like, I don't think you're qualified for an opinion, but okay. Poor Vista. It will get fixed. And if that wasn't bad enough, in the midst of all of this, in 2007, we get this goofy phone. Now, what we didn't know at the time is that this was the end of the road for phones, right? This was the phone with capacitive touch and skeuomorphic design. Before the iPhone, phones were kind of fun. We had keyboards, some of them would slide out, different kinds of antenna attachments. But after, all the phones are the same. Just slabs of black glass, one right after the other. It's kind of boring. And nobody takes it seriously at Microsoft, certainly not not Steve, so we missed that boat. But another side of that open source, that open web space was Netflix. Now, Netflix originally was in the business of shipping DVDs in red envelopes, and you would ship them back whenever you were finished with them. And they wanted to get into streaming, right? This is early days, 2007, 2008. And so Reed Hastings went to Microsoft and said, hey, the internet's only so fast. I have multiple resolutions of each of these movies. Can you build me a player that would shift resolutions automatically? And Microsoft had been working on an extended version of WPF they called WPFE for Windows Presentation Foundation everywhere. And they incorporated them with media services to do this variable streaming system. And because it had a terrible code name, WPFE, it got a great product name, Silverlight. Now, the first version of Silverlight was just for the streaming stuff. There was no C# in it at all. It was Java, purely JavaScript operated, but it was meant to solve this particular problem for Netflix and other streamers. But the subsequent versions, they built a small version of the .NET framework that would run on multiple platforms, including the Mac, for both PC and Intel. So they were cross-platforming .NET in 2008. But they were also doing it asynchronously. Instead of waiting for new versions of Studio to ship, they had set up Codeplex, and they were pushing out versions over there. So they put up 4 versions of Silverlight in 2 years, way faster than normal Microsoft cadence, and experimenting with different ways to deliver features to folks. This is also when .NET MVC comes along. Now, Scott Guthrie, his learnings out of Mix, he realized, like, we need to be more open web-like. And so he wanted more open source people around him. Now, and I'm making .NET Rocks the whole time, so I notice when he starts grabbing these open source people, guys like Scott Hanselman and Phil Hack and Rob Connery, all in a matter of months. And I'm like, how are you recruiting these people so quickly? Like, they're pretty good folks. And what he was doing was showing them prototypes of .NET MVC and saying, I want to change how we do web development, come with me. And so they all joined in, and we're playing with this idea of a more scalable way to build .NET web apps. Now, there's an apocryphal story. There was a group that were big on open source in the Microsoft space long before Microsoft was. I originally encountered them as the .NET Rocks guy because they were complaining about how Microsoft was building Entity Framework when they weren't supporting NHibernate. And Hibernate was an open source ORM. So I called them the NHibernate Mafia, which they did not like. So they needed to come up with a new name right away. They called themselves Alt.NET. And the idea behind Alt.NET was that we should be incorporating open source into Microsoft tooling, right? Now, they went about it in a way that made a lot of people upset. But they also weren't wrong. You know, today, it's very obvious. We've got open source everywhere in the Microsoft space. And they actually made a conference in Austin, Texas, and invited Guthrie to keynote at it. And so Guthrie went down there and wrote the first demo app for MVC on the way down and blindsided them all. Because nobody had seen MVC out of Microsoft at that point, but at Alt.NET he showed it off and said, here you go, a testable, scalable way to build websites in .NET. Any questions? And they were a pretty fierce bunch, and they were sort of shouty. And there's a very famous picture of Hanselman, if you look for it, of him holding up a Post-it note. He's at that same conference, and all it says on the Post-it note is, why so mean? Anyway, those guys get together and they start doing these MVC books. This is actually from the cover of the book. This is a composite set of photographs. So they were never together for this picture. In fact, that picture of Guthrie is his picture from from his badge on his Microsoft badge from when he joined the company in 1997. So it's like almost a 10-year-old picture at that point. But yeah, they made this book, and they start doing this new iteration for Microsoft where they're making changes to MVC internally, then they're pushing that version to Codeplex so that anybody can download and experiment with it and give them feedback, and then they make new changes. So they're not doing it open source the way we thought about it. The source control is still completely protected, but they're making the source available for people to tinker with and experiment with and give them feedback on. So it's a more constructive way to work, and it's sort of a progress towards this model. By 2007, we get the real .NET 3, but they call it 3.5 because they had to make the emergency one. This is the end of the road for J#. This is when Link first shows up, and they're starting to surface XAML as WPF, and so they've got Expression Blend and all these other tools. We're trying to do shows to show how designers and developers would work side by side. And for like the 4 companies who could do it, it was awesome. Everybody else, it was impossible. But we were trying. In the PDC at 08, we're just about to the last PDC. We're at that point. We're at Silverlight has the programming language in it now. Now we find out where the word Silverlight really came from. You ever wondered, like, how did they come up with that? Because the Silverlight's a known word, right? You remember those old flash bulbs for cameras, the rotary ones? They had 4 flashes in them, and like you click it, it would flash, and then it turns, and you can do another one. The dust that's left behind from the bulb when you pump the electricity to make the flash, that's called Silverlight, because Silverlight is what comes after flash. But of course, it has a runtime, and so it needs to be managed that way. But they're already up to several versions of Silverlight, right? This is at the PDC in '08, so they're at 4, and this is the first draft of HTML5 is out. But this is also where the new chief architect at Microsoft, Ray Ozzie, talks about Azure for the first time. It's also when they ship Windows 7, so Steven Sinofsky's taken over Windows and he's fixed all the problems in that. And they finally, by 2009, shipped Windows Azure. It was originally called Windows Azure. Okay. And the first version is available to use in 2010, and it's got SQL Azure in it, plus support for PHP, Java, and .NET in the web roles and the worker roles. And a couple months later, this big iPhone shows up and upsets everybody. Because right after they show the iPad off, Steve Jobs puts out a letter called Thoughts on Flash. Now, what Steve knows is that Flash was never meant to run on mobile devices, right? It was meant for PCs that are plugged into the wall, and Flash just mows through battery, and so it's killing his iPad. But he actually couches the situation in a security context. He says, listen, plugins are dangerous, which is true. If you were in the tech space back then, every Christmas when you went to your parents' place, you put their address bars back because they'd always been replaced with various kinds of malware. You see, I can see the people who remember doing this, right? It was that bad. And so getting rid of plugins was a legitimate thing, but it meant Flash was doomed. But also, Silverlight was doomed, because now we weren't going to get plugins in browsers anymore. And it started with Safari, but it rapidly spread to all of them. So we're now in a situation. This is also when WinPhone 7 gets announced, and the programming environment for WinPhone 7 is a subset of Silverlight. All right, 2010, arguably one of the very best versions of Studio ever. It's April of 2010, so we had the announcements of the iPad, thoughts on Flash. April 2010, they announced Studio. This comes with F#, the fourth version of Silverlight, which runs out of the browser, also on the Mac, and supports Chrome as well. This is also when Microsoft bundles jQuery into Visual Studio. So remember the MVC iteration on CodePlex? So the MVC people figure out they need a object navigator, a DOM navigator for the browser if they're going to make MVC work right. So they start writing their own, and the whole community goes, "What are you doing? John Resig solved this problem 4 years ago. Just use jQuery." And they listen. And so Microsoft incorporates an open source product without changing the license and provides support for it as a Visual Studio 2010. So kind of a revelation for them to do that. And then they also start supporting jQuery in a big way. They kick it a bunch of money, which is why jQuery becomes a jQuery Foundation, which now is known as the JavaScript Foundation. The very last PDC happens in 2010 on campus. It's kind of a train wreck of a PDC. There's only about 1,000 attendees. There's only so much room. It rained the entire time because it's the Pacific Northwest. And that's where there were no Silverlight sessions. In April of 2010, Silverlight was presented as the de facto way for enterprises to build software that runs on both the Mac and the PC. And in October of 2010, no Silverlight sessions. And Mary Jo Foley asked Bob Mugley, who at the time was the head of server and tools, so why no Silverlight sessions? And Bob says, well, our strategy has shifted. That's all he said, right? I've later talked to Bob about this, and he didn't know he was the first person to talk about Silverlight since Thoughts on Flash, right? Internally, the company completely pivoted. But Microsoft had stopped communicating after the iPad came out. They were so scared of the iPad, they were getting ready to build a version of Windows that could battle the iPad. The iPad was going to take over the whole market. And so they'd kind of gone silent. And nobody had talked about the fact that Silverlight was in big trouble and their strategy had to shift. So they just not told anyone. And of course, MJ just published what Bob said. Everybody else said, well, Silverlight's dead. And they weren't wrong. I mean, there would be another version of Silverlight. 5 would come out in the fall of 2011 and would be supported for 10 years. So Silverlight only went out of support in 2021. But the damage was done. I mean, it was pretty upsetting for folks to have done this. This is also the moment when Anders Hallsberg decides to step away from C#, hands it off to our friend Mads Torgersen, who's here, and he goes to work on something else which we won't know about for a while, but we'll eventually find out it's TypeScript. But at that moment, we're like, where's Anders going? So in all of it, this was a very dark time to be in the Microsoft space. We were all pretty scared. Now, the web's ripping and snorting at this time. This is when IE9's coming out, Firefox, Chrome, and they're starting to take the JavaScript engine out of the browser. This is Chrome's V8 engine, and they're dramatically improving it to do all the things that HTML5 wants to do. But this also really helps Node, which had been around for a few years. But this idea of JavaScript not just being a scripting language in the browser, it really comes to fruition in 2011. That's when we see this sort of motion towards these more powerful JavaScript engines and all the power in that. And also in 2011, we get the very first build. So PDC is done. It's now called Build. It actually is Build Windows, right? And this is where they're going to present Windows 8 to us. And they've come to the conclusion that JavaScript is the lingua franca of the world, and so we got to make sure JavaScript is the language that works absolutely everywhere, including inside of Windows, which is why they present Win.js. Now, it's not crazy to have Microsoft think this way. If you think about the situation in 2011, I went over the annual reports from Microsoft in 2011, and they had a dozen billion-dollar businesses inside of the company. These were them. And you'll notice that 9 of these depend on Windows. The 3 that don't are Xbox, which is also going through the red ring of death, so they may have brought in a couple of $1 billion, but they're spending like $4. Bing, which makes $1 billion, but takes $2 billion to do it, and Skype, which they dropped $8 billion on and had no revenue streams really available to them whatsoever. So all of Microsoft's money comes from Windows. Needless to say, they're going to defend Windows. There's no two ways about that. Also in 2011, our friend Miguel de Icaza reappears. He'd been happily working on Mono, but he's starting to experiment on other places to run C#, and he created a tool he called Mono Touch that allowed him to write C# to work against the iPhone. It made Apple angry, but Miguel was good at that part. He knew how to deal with it, and now he'd built a version of Mono for Android. And I actually said on the show, it's like, with Anders gone, I think the biggest advocate for C# right now doesn't work at Microsoft is Miguel de Icaza. The problem is Miguel had been working under Novell for years, and Novell just got sold to a company called Attachmate. And Attachmate says to Miguel, hey, we love what you're doing except for the part where you make no money at all. So we need you to lay off your entire team, and when you're finished, lay yourself off too. And Miguel calls his friend Nat Friedman and says, we got to do something here. And Nat's a good startup guy, so he puts together a company with Miguel. We now know it's Xamarin. And their whole goal is mobile development, right? We're going to save Mono with these tools that allow us to use C# against iPhone and Android. And in 2012, we get the current logo for Microsoft with the colorable boxes and the boring text. So we're fully 21st century corporatized. It's a shame. Microsoft's getting the groove on open source, and they actually set up a group in 2013 called MS Open Tech, or MS Open Technologies. For us out in the world, it looked like what they were doing is making sure that all the important open source libraries like Memcached and Redis and so forth have good C# libraries for them. But on the inside, they're actually moving teams in there to work on open source versions of Microsoft products. And one of the very first ones they did was Entity Framework. The Entity Framework guys wanted to build an open source version. The problem is that when Microsoft builds software, they cover it in patents. If you work for Microsoft writing code, every time you do a check-in, you sit with a lawyer and review what you've done, and if they like it, they'll write a patent around it, and you'll get a bonus for every patent you land. So at that point, Entity Framework was a few years old, and there were several hundred patents laid on it, but they wanted to open source it, and they felt like, well, we can't open source them with a patent on it, so let's straighten out all the patents. And so the deal was they wanted to open source, so they had to review every single patent that had ever been done with the team, with the guys who had written it, and figured out it was in conflict with the product. And so they went through, some of these patents were worthless, so they just sort of ditched them, no big deal. Some were potentially, some of them, weren't a big deal, but every so often you'd run into one was like, that's very clever and potentially valuable, and it's in the code. And so they would rewrite pieces of any framework to no longer conflict with the patent, which is crazy. They wrote that code that caused that patent in the first place, and now they weren't allowed to use it anymore. It took them almost a year, but they got to the bottom of it, and when they'd done it, they open sourced Entity Framework, and it was like a lightning bolt inside of Microsoft, because you can open source an existing product. That's mad. Let's figure out how they did it. And when they found out how they did it, that that's even crazier. You shouldn't do that. And Microsoft started simplifying the process. OpenTech only lasted for a couple of years before they realized this was all self-inflicted complexity, and they rolled it back into Microsoft in 2015. So in 2012, we get the next version of Studio, one of the most lowest version of Studios, mostly because all of the menus were in uppercase, and that made people sad. But this was the version that was designed to work with Windows 8, including supporting WinRT, the ARM version of Windows, that time. And that takes us to build, well, actually, I missed the line. In build 2011, Carl and I walked out of that conference, and I said to him, what if .NET doesn't rock? Like, we just saw a conference about Microsoft development, no C# sessions. And we make a podcast that's fairly clearly defined. So that's when we stood up the tablet show. It was our alternative space to put stuff. It was for all tablet development and mobile development and so forth. And then after a few years, we realized .NET did rock, and we just rolled it back into .NET Rocks. But in 2012 is when they actually shipped Windows 8. With Studio 12, WinJS 1.0, which won't make another version. And they've been pushing really hard to fill out a store for all the tablet version of Windows, and it's mostly got C# XAML apps in it. So WinJS doesn't take off. Win 8 is not exactly the most popular product in the world. That's as far as they get. And with that flop, teams change around, the leadership shifts, and very quickly we get to Studio 2013. Most important feature in this is return to lowercase menus. So we're all a bit happier there. They start to fix Win 8, get to Win 8.1. But also they realize internally that Azure is a more important product than Windows. And this is a very fundamental shift inside of Microsoft. Right? 30 years, Windows have been the center of it. And the first time we knew how big the change was is when they changed the name of Azure. In 2013, it wasn't Windows Azure anymore. It was Microsoft Azure. That was the beginning of a motion. Part of it was, after Win 8 was a flop, there was a meeting in 2013, senior leadership. And the Office team said, listen, we've had Office for Android and iPhone for a couple of years sitting on the shelf, and you've told us we were never going to need it because you had UWP, you had Universal Windows Platform that was going to be everywhere. There was going to be a phone, there was going to be the operating system, and it was going to run Office all over. Nobody's running it. You don't believe it's going to be well adopted. We want to ship this. We need to get out there and get on iOS and Android. And the leadership agreed. And it was the first time in 30 years that a product was put above Windows' needs. And again, a lightning bolt inside of the company that, oh my God, Azure is more important than Windows. If you want to be successful at Microsoft, you need to work at Azure. Like, it changed the dynamic internal to the company. So we have that open source movement, we have that shift there. This is when Ballmer realizes he has to step aside because he's been the Windows advocate the whole time. They go looking for a new CEO, and they get the guy who used to run Bing, Satya Nadella. Now, he comes in February, and in April of 2014, we get the first build with Satya as CEO. And this is also when they talk about the .NET Foundation, and when they open source and cross-platform Roslyn. Right? So this was the compiler as a service for .NET. It's also the first compiler, .NET compiler, that was actually written in C#, because grown-up languages write themselves in themselves. It's a weird language thing you're supposed to do. But here was a language that was already more than 10 years old, and they'd never done that. And the only reason they finally get to it is because they were now parallelizing. They had the regular compiler, but they also had this internal compiler for IntelliSense so that it could squiggle when you were doing things wrong. And maintaining two versions was making them crazy, because sometimes they weren't the same and everybody was sad. And so the compiler as a service was about having a compiler that could both work in real time for IntelliSense and was the primary compiler. That's Roslyn. And at Build in 2014, Anders got up and shipped Roslyn. That's also when they announced TypeScript 1.0. And TypeScript was a huge hit with the open source community. Microsoft people firmly believed that it was impossible for the open source community to like anything Microsoft did. They just didn't think it was possible. And yet when TypeScript came out and it provided all this capability for building more reliable JavaScript applications, Lots of the community jumped on board. All kinds of groups that were normally pretty hostile to Microsoft implemented the files to allow their libraries to work with TypeScript. The Eclipse team implemented support for TypeScript in their programming environment. And it sort of freaked Microsoft out. It's like, what? Why are they doing this? Why are they being nice to us? Like, this is confusing. But it also spoke to the fact that when you do the right thing in the space, they respond. And so later that year, they said, we're going to rewrite .NET, and we're going to rewrite it open source and cross-platform, because we're a cloud company now. We don't want to be bound to Windows, and the old version of .NET is too deeply bound to Windows. The only way to do this is to start over. It's going to take them years, but they're also going to completely change the development process inside of Microsoft. They're now going to build .NET on GitHub. No more internal source code control tools, all of it out in the open. And it's one of the reasons it took them so long. They relearned the way to build software to do it in this style, and it took a while to get it right. The 2015 version of Studio is the one that goes with Win 10. It also has the Edge browser. MS OpenText is back in. We sort of put all these pieces together. Another team under Chris Diaz deliberately builds an open source product. It's like, look, if we do it right, we can make open source products that people like, so let's go make one intentionally, Visual Studio Code. Working through Electron, build a great editor, the best one they know how to build. And we know how well that went. It's the most popular editor in the world. So Microsoft is learning. They're figuring out how to work in an open source world and be part of that whole equation. 2016, they acquire Xamarin. So now they've brought the mobile tools in. Now, it's not an easy fit. They also have MonoDevelop, which they foolishly renamed Visual Studio for the Mac. And Miguel goes and works for a while on Xamarin and ultimately works on the larger XAML problem as a whole. Nat heads over to the TFS team at the point where Team Foundation Server is trying to be a competitor to Atlassian and be more of what we now know as Azure DevOps. But they were in that transition when they're working on those pieces. So they both go internal to the company for a few years. We finally get .NET Core in 2016. Again, they licensed with MIT, and then they iterate quickly. We get a 1.1 in 2017, 2.0 in August of 2017, 2.1 in 2018. And also in 2018, they acquire GitHub, and Nat Friedman becomes the CEO of a wholly owned subsidiary. Nat had always been a Valley guy, even though Xamarin was largely in Massachusetts. He had close connections inside of GitHub, so he was the right guy to come in there, not freak everybody out. There was lots of people afraid when Microsoft took over GitHub, but the reality was there were three bidders. There was Microsoft, there was Google, and there was ByteDance. And so, yeah. And so, in hindsight, folks said, they're better off with Microsoft. They are the largest consumers of GitHub at this point. They've moved most of their product. Like, they're highly motivated to keep it alive. And we generally know what's going to happen. The main thing that Microsoft did when they took it over was take away charging for things. They would eventually build new enterprise features, but they're just like, we need to keep this going. Everything's fine. Nat would only be there for a few years before Thomas Demke would take over, and he's gone now too. The iterations of .NET Core continue, 2.2, 3.0, 3.1. The 3s were the version where they started doing the SDKs for UX stuff now, so that's when we get the new version of WinForms. That will run independently, but it's not pixel perfect anymore because it's going to handle high resolution screens and so forth, so we have a few challenges with that. And that allows them to go directly from 3 to 5 because the original framework was in 4. They don't want to create confusion, so 5 is supposed to be the unified platform. This is a straight copy of the slide of the time, of the strategy for how all of this stuff will work together, maybe someday. It's nice to see that at that point, we're talking 2020, they already have an AI on there, right? This ML.NET is happening and Spark and so forth, but they're trying to unify all these pieces. It's a battle, and it's a battle that's still going on to this day, right? And believe me, 4.8 is not going anywhere. Windows depends on it. I would also be clear, the VB6 runtime still ships with Windows as well. So, these base level things just don't go away. They're going to be around for a long time. Also in 2020, our friend Steve Sanderson at an NDC conference finds an open source version of C#, a weird version, and combines it with WebAssembly. And this is 2016 when he shows this off, and breaks everybody's brains because we're now running C# inside our browser. Should be impossible. But Miguel Diaz-Casa jumps on board. Over a summer, they rewrite the entire thing a couple of times and get it to run pretty well. It actually scares Microsoft. They leave it as a beta project for several years because they don't want to be seen those are the guys who go after JavaScript. But they eventually do ship it in 2020. Right after Golang for WebAssembly shipped, they pushed out Blazor. That's when it was only when there was somebody else who had done it first that they actually went ahead and shipped it as a supported product. And this makes like web forms people very happy. It's a development paradigm they understand. It gives them all the strength. For the most part, they run it in server configuration anyway. Most people don't run the client configuration, but you have choices. But that's how that ultimately went down. .NET 6 in 2021 is where we actually unify the Mono and .NET BCLs. And try to level everything out. We're trying to get everybody together in .NET 5. Now 6, they sort of smooth things out, except for one little incident just before shipping time. I don't know if you remember this. We know it as the hot reload incident. Literally 2 weeks before they were going to ship, blog post comes out. Hot reload is going to be taken out of the product. At first, actually, what happens is on GitHub, the hot loaded features just disappear from the repository. And a whole bunch of folks are pretty upset about that because they're using it everywhere, right? Even though it hasn't got tooling or anything at this point, it's still the beta versions. Hot reload's incredibly powerful tool. This ability to make changes and continue execution, not have to break and rerun and so forth. Everybody's using it, everywhere. But these folks inside of the company are convinced that this is an enterprise class product it should be charged for. They're just a little late, so they pull it from the product and put out these blog posts about, hey, this is just going to be for the enterprise edition. We'll bring it to other versions later. And by the next day, the outcry is so large, like, no, we know. Don't worry, we're gonna work on this to be fine. And what really happened was a group of Linux guys inside of Microsoft went to their VP and said, hey, all our deliverables have to be delayed because we've lost hot reload. And that VP called another VP, loud noises happened, and by Monday it was back in the repository. So it was Hansman has this great line that I love dearly, which says, we are not organized enough to be as evil as you think we are. There are parts of Microsoft that understand open source. There are parts that don't. There are parts that understand the scope of development going inside of Microsoft and how it builds, and stuff that don't. And this was one of those moments where a somewhat impetuous decision to monetize a feature impacted far more places than they ever realized, and it just reminded a bunch of folks, this is not how you do things anymore. The company has changed whether you know it or not. In the .NET 7 timeframe, well, actually .NET 6, it was supposed to come out, was MAUI. So this unification of the UX strategy. So this is Xamarin Forms alongside WPF, trying to unify them all together. It's a big struggle between the different teams. For the most part, customers don't care, and they were trying to do an impossible thing in .NET 6. Not only was it a big version of .NET, it was also a big version of Visual Studio, right? This is 2012. And so the MAUI team, everything was breaking for them the whole time they were building it. And David Hortnow might be around here somewhere, but I still see the tear stains on his face from fighting through this. That it took them till the fall of the next year or the spring of the next year to really get it up to speed. And arguably .NET 7 is the version where we started to see all the fixes for MAUI. And in .NET 8, the performance increased in there. Another big one in .NET 8, and this is Safia's fault, is .NET Aspire. Our friend, distinguished engineer, David Fowler, he of Signal R fame and other products, decided that we needed to be better at making cloud native. And so, C#'s a general purpose language, and .NET Framework could be used in all kinds of things. But if you really want to be cloud native, there's certain strategies that make sense. And so this set of tools, really kind of scaffolding, leads you down the pit of success to build in a cloud native style. It's gone through a bunch of iterations already. They started with 9, I think it's at 9.5 right now. One would speculate that sometime in the next month or so, there'll be another version of .NET. Oddly enough, it's been November for many years in a row, where I suspect we'll see an Aspire 10. Just a guess. I don't know for sure. But it begs the question, so what comes next after this? And I asked this question of Mads Torgersen a number of years ago as all these alignments were happening. It's like, how do you keep a 20-plus-year-old framework relevant? I can still write code like I'm in C#2, and it'll run. I don't have to write in C#12. And he's like, yeah, that's a tooling job. But today we know for sure, especially if you're looking at Studio 2026, it's going to be an LLM's job, right? We're getting better and better and smarter tools, which is actually what Microsoft was always in the business of, is giving us better tools to provide better solutions in less time. So what do I think is next? Making better software with new tools. And I'll be telling a different version of the story by next year when these new tools come down. I hope this was useful for you. Thank you for your time.